Ever wondered why people say it's dangerous to enter or even disturb a fairy ring? What's the worst that could happen if you step foot into a fairy ring? Well, you might be surprised to know that there are numerous accounts of people who have entered fairy rings and lived to tell the tale. And I will share some shocking true stories with you in just a minute. But first, let's figure out what a fairy ring is and why they are so important to those of the fairy realm. Fairy rings are nothing new. They can and do pop up anywhere. Sure, the scientists will give you some chat about them being naturally occurring phenomena, and they may be right. But that doesn't mean they're not also created by and used by fairies. Fairy rings can pop up in all sorts of places, and you certainly wouldn't want to unknowingly wander into one. Why they choose particular locations for rings isn't clear, but I wonder if they recognise something to the land which we don't. Perhaps an energy similar to ley lines or spirit of place. Or perhaps they choose sites on neutral land where all fairy can gather in safety and convenience. Fairy rings are generally circular and vary in size. They are usually made of mushrooms, but on occasion a fairy ring of white stones, shells or other objects from nature have been found. Mushroom fairy rings are common within woodlands but can just as easily be found in open fields and even back gardens. The most interesting fairy rings are found circling around particular trees, such as the hawthorn or the rowan tree. These very special fairy trees will feature in their very own videos, so look out for those in the coming weeks. For thousands of years, people from many cultures, particularly in Western Europe, have regarded fairy rings with an equal measure of fear and reverence. Many believe that the favourite resting place of fairies is under a hawthorn tree, and to this very day any canny farmer will give a hawthorn tree on their land a wide berth. But if a fairy ring appears around the hawthorn tree, well, that's a sign to back right off. Oh, and when I say resting place, I mean a place to rest, not their eternal resting place. Because fairy rings are also long believed to be a place where the fairies gather to party, to sing and dance and celebrate. As we know, fairies take their revelry very seriously, and anyone who should disturb their pursuit of pleasure would draw the attention of the fairy, and that's always a dangerous position to find yourself in. But I wonder, though, if there are other reasons fairy might gather at a fairy ring. If we believe that fairies have lived beside us for these many ages, it might be safe to believe that there is some organisation to their society, some structure. Well, I don't believe for a moment that fairy burden themselves with the labyrinth of laws and rules as we do. They live in harmony with the natural world, and as such, I believe they follow the rules and cycles of nature. But that said, there must be, on occasion, a need for fairies to gather for reasons other than celebration. Perhaps to resolve conflict, to conduct ceremonies or pay tribute to those past, perhaps even to conduct commerce or trade, who knows. But we do know that fairy are itchy-footed folk. They like a ramble, don't they? So perhaps a fairy clan will gather within a single ring once every 3 moon months, let's say, to catch up with each other over a meal and a dance. What do you think? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. No matter if the fairy use fairy rings to sing and dance, or to honour the dead, or settle disputes, they seem to react in varying levels of harshness to people who disturb their sacred space. There are loads of tales of encounters with fairies in and around fairy rings, and I've picked just a few curious ones to give you the gist of what can happen. Farmers and gardeners are often surprised to discover a fairy ring has appeared overnight. In the past, traditional farmers would never dream of allowing their animals to graze within or even near a fairy ring, as they believed it would sour the milk, or worse, cause mass death within their herd, and perhaps they had good reason to fear. In an upcoming video, I'll share true stories of people who have encountered fairy activity in a fairy ring. Before we go there, I want to shake things up a bit and share 3 stories which just might shock you. When fairy are angered at disturbances to their fairy rings, it's not just humans that they will take their fury out on. There are many strange accounts of sudden and inexplicable deaths in relation to fairy rings. In around the 1860s, a man by the name of Kinsella was ploughing a field in the village of Kill in Ireland. When he was in the middle of the field, he saw a ring made of mushrooms. Kinsella paid no mind to the sight and drove on, but when his horses put their feet in the ring, they fell dead. Kinsella ran to the house and told the people of the house what had happened, and they scolded him for a fool, saying that he had only tried to plough in a fairy ring. When I read a tale like this, I like to imagine what the fairy within the ring might have been doing when they were interrupted. We might think it was something of grave importance, such as a ceremony or a ritual of some sort, or even a birth. They were certainly shocked and outraged at Kinsella's actions, not only for interrupting, but for not respecting their space. Given that other local people understood not to interfere with the fairy ring, the fairy knew that he should have known better. At the turn of the 19th century, there lived a man named Travers in Bridgetown, County Wexford. He had a horse, and one night he put her out in a field where he knew there to be a fairy ring. Well, it was believed that the fairies hunted this horse around the field all night, because the next morning the horse came to the gate in a state of exhaustion. The sweat was running down off her. Travers' mind immediately turned to the fairy ring, and he suspected that he had made a mistake in leaving her in that field overnight. He sent for a man named Walters, who was known far and wide to be wise to the ways of the fairies. Walters told Travers to put down a post in the ground and tie the horse to it, and to leave the horse to go around the post from sunrise until sunset, and that this would set things right, as the horse could rest without being hounded or herded by the fairy. Travers did what he was told, but unfortunately, the damage had been done. Just before noon that day, the horse collapsed and died. There's something particularly shocking about this one for me. I'm not nearly so surprised or shocked if the fairy should punish humans, because we've been warned for hundreds of years and should know better. But the fact they would punish or cause the death of an animal for entering a fairy ring is quite disturbing. What could the fairy be doing in that ring to cause such fury at the interruption that they would persecute the horse? Well, in this case of Travis's horse, I suspect they were simply engaging in some wild play, a long and intense session of entertainment which unfortunately led to the horse's exhaustion and eventual death. But what else might cause them to harm a human or an animal? Well, we know that fairy are nothing like Tinkerbells. There are surely some with a caring nature, but just as many or more with no regard for our human sensitivities at all. If they were gathered in a ring to care for one of their own who was sick or injured, or they were conducting a solemn ritual to the dead or dying, or battling over some conflict, is it any surprise that human interference would be met with anger? In around the year 1910, there was a farmer who thought he was clever to sow his oats in a large fairy ring. Well, the oats got ripe and were cut and were ready to be drawn in. So the farmer came out with his men to draw in the oats, but as they came near the fairy ring, the farmer saw all the sheaves getting thrown up in the air, but in the bluster he couldn't see who was throwing them up in the air. And when the oats hit the ground, there was not a single grain to be seen. The farmer immediately blessed himself 3 times and cursed, "I sowed the oats on the fairy ring." But it must be said, not everyone is adversely affected by fairy rings. In Wales, many consider fairy rings to be good luck. While they still don't encourage people to enter them, farmers value the land containing fairy rings and believe that crops grown around them and livestock feeding nearby will flourish. In fact, it is said that Welsh sheep are the only beasts which fairy allow to eat the grass that grows in their fairy rings. All other creatures will go nowhere near the ring, but the sheep eat it with great enthusiasm, and this is why many believe that Welsh mutton is tastier than any other in the world. Keep an eye out for my next video featuring fairy rings, where we'll share true stories of strange human experiences. But until then, if you see a fairy ring, don't just think of yourself. If you have a child or a dog or a cat, a horse, a rabbit, you might want to keep them well away from the fairy ring too. Thanks for spending time with me today. I really appreciate it. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you'll love the one on screen now. Just click on it to watch. Until next time, stay curious and be kind. Cheerio!